Paris is hosting an emergency gathering of European leaders ahead of talks between the US and Russia about ending the war in Ukraine. Ahead of those discussions, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte is meeting with the US Special Envoy for Ukraine and Russia, Keith Kellogg, in Brussels. The US has signaled that Europe will not be included in negotiations between Washington and Moscow. And for more on this, we can bring in our correspondent, Jack Parrock, in Brussels. Jack, NATO Chief Mark Rutte is about to meet the U.S. Special Envoy for Ukraine. What can you tell us about this meeting?
Yeah, not so much at the moment. They have got just the meeting on the agenda. We know that there will be no press opportunities. Keith Kellogg himself is expected to do some sort of discussion later on today. But this is all part of a big round of meetings, a flurry of meetings that have happened, that have been put into the calendar as well after this Munich Security Conference, where so many things appear to have shifted. Keith Kellogg is significant because he said at the Munich Security Conference over the weekend that Europe being at the negotiating table for any peace talks on Ukraine is, quote, not going to happen. So Mark Rutte is going to be speaking with him, presumably trying to make sure that NATO and the European allies, he's a former Dutch Prime Minister himself, will be at tables with peace talks, trying to persuade Kellogg and therefore the Trump administration in the United States around to allowing that. Then Mark Rutte will quickly hot foot over to Paris to join other European leaders, especially from the big European countries and the institutions of the European Union, for a meeting at the Elysee that has been called by the French President Emmanuel Macron, looking at how to make sure that Europe does have a seat at this table, considering as well, and what's important for the Europeans, is that they've spent relatively similar amounts of money on the Ukraine war as Russia's invasion, at least, of Ukraine, as the United States has. If you look at the graphs of how much military spending and financial aid to Ukraine have gone in total, they're sort of matching between the United States and the Europeans as well.
Mm-hmm. It does seem like it comes as a surprise to European leaders now at the back of the Munich Security Conference. And we're seeing leaders scrambling. You said it there, a flurry of meetings to prove their relevance and their the thing that they can do something in the resolution of this Ukraine war. What options do they have realistically on the table now, though?
Well, what they firstly want to make sure that they can do is get at that table. And the argument of the financial spending that the Europeans have put so much money on the table is important and perhaps potentially able to persuade the United States to allow them. The question is whether the US really wants this. What we saw is Donald Trump have that phone call with the Russian President Vladimir Putin, which is contrary to what the Europeans have been trying to do. They don't want to sort of engage with the invader. Instead, they've wanted to support Ukraine. Now the Europeans have to realize that that's happening, whether they like it or not. The US is reaching out directly to Moscow at the highest level, and therefore they might want to change tactic. We don't know what the leaders are going to discuss in Paris. They aren't expected to come out with any specific statements or announcements of exactly what they're going to do. The leaders of France, Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark, the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer will also attend, Italy, and as I said, the leaders of the European Union, also Poland as well. They'll also be involved, but not all of the EU countries are going to be there in Paris. And what they'll be trying to do is show unity. That's what we understand. French officials aren't saying that we're expecting a big statement.
Let's talk about something that Keir Starmer, precisely now that you mentioned him, raised yesterday in an interview. He said that his country and Sweden kind of went in lockstep with him, are saying that they'd be willing to send peacekeeping troops to Ukraine. What do other European nations think about this now that we speak about unity?
Well, a lot of European countries, I think, would understand that to get a peace deal together would probably involve some sort of European or Western peacekeeping forces on the ground, some sort of buffer zone in eastern Ukraine. What that exactly means is still up for debate. And what's important is the United States, the Trump administration, has said that they won't be putting any boots on the ground in eastern Ukraine, and that if there was a peace deal, it would be prerequisite on the the Europeans to do so. As you say, Keir Starmer, he in an op-ed in the Telegraph newspaper said that the UK would be willing to, he would be prepared to send British troops on the ground to the front line. A Swedish foreign minister told Swedish press that their government doesn't exclude anything. So that there's sort of a tide turning, a sort of public shift by some of these big European countries to say that they would be willing to do that, which could appease the United States and the Trump administration. Then the big question is how many troops? A sort of number that's being floated around by a lot of different analysts has been 100,000 troops. Where would they come from? How would they be made up? And what that would entail, well, we'll have to wait and see.
That's Jack Parrock in Brussels. Great speaking to you. Thanks. Let's bring in Olaf Böhnke, Berlin director and senior advisor at the Alliance of Democracies Foundation, expert on foreign and security policy. It's great to have you on DW, Olaf. Now, Europe is scrambling to avoid being left out in the cold. How significant is this transatlantic rift Trump seems to be ushering in?
It's quite significant, no doubt. What's kind of surprising is that everyone is surprised. So because what happened in Munich the entire week, so I wouldn't even just single it or focus on the J.D. Vance speech, which is very much in the center of the conversation. But it's actually the entire week what we have seen from the U.S. side, which is confusing the Europeans totally. And it's a bit sad because experts like me had predicted this to come actually for years now, to be honest, and it had not happened. And the fact that we are having an emergency summit by Macron today in Paris is quite off-telling, because you could have prepared for the situation as it is right now way in advance.
All right. The preparation didn't happen. What concrete steps can European countries take now to avoid being sidelined, especially when it comes to ending the war in Ukraine?
I mean, it was it made the news earlier this morning that obviously the U.S. administration had sent out a very formal request to all the European capitals, walking the talk and coming up with numbers of troops, of military equipment they can provide concretely to support Ukraine. This was a conversation the Europeans avoided for months and years. So I remember here in Germany, so also during the election campaign, no one ever touched on numbers. So how many troops? We had this conversation within the government. We had the foreign minister, Baerbock. She said, yes, maybe if there's a peace, then Germany needs to send. And the chancellor immediately stopped this conversation. Now, all of a sudden, so they need to come together in Paris and concretely discuss, so what can we bring to the table, because they are not at the table. So at the moment, actually, the US said in Munich, General Kellogg, the special envoy of Ukraine, told the Europeans in the room, heads of governments, you will not be at the table. So it's Russia and us and maybe the Ukrainians. And now they are quite begging. And that's really, really a shame.
Mm-hmm. The first table we're going to see is probably going to be in Saudi Arabia. American and Russian envoys are set to meet there. What do you expect to come out of these talks?
I don't expect anything concretely to come out of this talk. So my interpretation of what had happened last week is also the U.S. the government doesn't have any plan. So what they are doing is in a very Trumpinian manner. They are going into a room, make a big splash, confuse everyone to the maximum, and then see how people react. And it completely worked out. The Europeans are now in arms, and they are confused, running like chickens in the room, meeting now in an emergency meeting in summit in Paris during the summit, and the Russians are playing this very cool. So I see the Russians at the moment in a very comfortable position. They will check out each other again in Saudi Arabia. And of course, they're playing with the red lines. So many people here in Europe already have the impression that Trump went way too far in giving in to Putin, even before they started any concrete negotiations, by accepting the loss of territory for Ukraine to the advantage of Russia. They also, he made that clear line, there will be no NATO membership. So these were demands by the Russian government, by Putin actually, and they had not even started the conversations, and Trump already gave in. But the good thing with Trump is you never know actually how easy and how quickly actually he will make a U-turn. So therefore, anything can happen in Saudi Arabia.
Olaf Böhnke of the Alliance of Democracies Foundation. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.